I lost my home and my business in the same month, and the two people who smiled while it happened were my own son and the woman he married. I remember the exact moment everything shifted, though at the time it felt small, almost forgettable, like a chair being quietly moved at the dinner table. Daniel stopped looking at me when he spoke. Not all at once, not in a way anyone could point to, but gradually, like a habit he was trying to break. And Vanessa, she filled the silence with a kind of sweetness that never quite reached her eyes. I had lived in that house for over 30 years, every inch of it shaped by my hands. From the kitchen cabinets I refinished myself to the little flower beds I planted along the front walk. But suddenly it felt like I was visiting, like I needed permission to exist in my own space. Conversations happened around me instead of with me. Decisions were made in low voices, behind closed doors. One morning, I opened the pantry and found half my things gone, neatly boxed and stacked in the garage, as if someone had already decided I wouldn't need them much longer. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself families go through phases, that maybe I was just struggling to adjust. But then came the meeting at the dining table, the same table where I had celebrated birthdays and holidays for decades, where Vanessa sat across from me with her hands folded and her tone calm, almost rehearsed. She spoke about what made sense, about space and future plans, and Daniel nodded beside her like he was listening to a presentation instead of talking about his own mother. When I said nothing, they took that as agreement. When I didn't argue, they assumed I didn't understand. And maybe that was my first mistake, letting them believe I was still the woman who would absorb discomfort just to keep the peace. The day I left, I packed only what I could carry. No raised voices.
No dramatic goodbye.
Just the quiet click of the front door closing behind me. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the house that used to be mine, and realized something that settled deep and heavy in my chest. They hadn't just pushed me out. They had already decided. I didn't belong there long before I ever picked up my suitcase. But losing the house wasn't the worst part. The worst part came a week later, when the small business I had spent years building, my little shop, my steady source of independence, began to unravel in ways that didn't feel like coincidence. Orders were suddenly canceled. A supplier I had worked with for years stopped returning my calls. A lease renewal I had counted on fell through without explanation. At first, I blamed bad luck. Then I started to notice the timing, the pattern, the quiet efficiency of it all. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself if I was overthinking things and started asking a different question entirely. What exactly had they planned while I was still living under their roof? That was the moment something inside me changed. I didn't cry. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't try to fix anything. I simply stepped back, looked at what was left, and understood that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be solved with kindness or patience. Not this time. I spent the first night in a small rental on the edge of town, the kind of place you only notice when you have nowhere else to go, with thin walls and a single lamp that hummed softly when it was turned on, and I remember sitting at the tiny kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, staring at nothing in particular and trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quietly that I had not even heard it coming. The silence there was different from the silence in my old home, not heavy with memories but empty, like a room that had never been lived in, and for the first time in decades, no one needed anything from me. No one expected me to fix a problem or smooth over a disagreement or remember a birthday, and that realization settled in slowly, like dust. I did not cry that night, not because I was strong, but because something inside me had already gone still, as if my emotions were waiting for permission to return. The next morning, I woke up early out of habit and reached for my phone, half expecting to see a message from Daniel, something simple, something human, but there was nothing, not even a missed call, and that told me more than any argument ever could. I dressed carefully, the same way I always had, pressed blouse, simple slacks, shoes polished out of routine rather than necessity, and I drove to my shop, hoping that at least that part of my life would still be standing where I had left it. The sign was still there, my name painted in soft gold lettering across the front window, but something felt wrong before I even unlocked the door. Inside, the shelves looked thinner, emptier, as if pieces had been quietly removed one by one, and when I checked my order book, I saw cancellations lined up in neat rows, names I recognized, customers who had been with me for years, all gone within the same week. I called my supplier, the one who had worked with me for over a decade, and his voice was polite but distant, telling me that they had decided to go in a different direction, that my account no longer fit their current structure, and when I asked for clarification, he hesitated just long enough for me to understand that this decision had not come from nowhere. I sat down behind the counter, running my fingers over the worn wood surface that had once felt like an extension of myself, and for a moment, I considered the possibility that this was just a series of unfortunate events, that I was connecting dots that did not belong together. But then I remembered the timing, the quiet conversations at home, the way Vanessa always seemed to know things before I said them, and a different kind of clarity began to form. It was not loud or dramatic. It did not come with anger or tears. It was simply a recognition that the life I had trusted, the people I had relied on, had been rearranged without my consent, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for me to return to. I closed the shop early that day, locking the door with a steady hand, and as I stood on the sidewalk looking at the reflection of my own name in the glass, I realized that I had been thinking about this all wrong. I had been asking how I could fix what was broken, how I could hold on to what remained, but the better question, the one that finally made sense, was what I still had that no one else had touched, and for the first time since I left that house, I felt something shift, not hope exactly, but something quieter and far more dangerous, a willingness to stop reacting and start paying attention. The next few days unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that I had not noticed before, as if events had been set in motion long before I ever stepped out of that house, and now I was simply watching them reach their intended conclusion. I returned to the shop each morning out of habit, unlocking the door, turning on the lights, straightening items that no one would come in to buy, and answering emails that had already decided their outcome before I even opened them. There was a pattern to the cancellations now, something too consistent to ignore, clients shifting to a new supplier across town, one that had appeared almost overnight with better pricing, faster delivery, and a level of coordination that felt strangely familiar. I did not need anyone to confirm it for me. I had seen Vanessa work before, the way she organized things, the way she positioned herself just close enough to understand how everything functioned without ever appearing involved. She had asked questions over the years that seemed casual at the time about my vendors, my pricing, my busiest seasons, and I had answered without hesitation because that is what family does. Now those same details were being used with a kind of efficiency that left very little room for coincidence. I sat behind the counter one afternoon, reviewing the last 3 months of transactions, and for the first time I stopped looking at what I had lost and started looking at what had been taken with intention. The numbers told a story I could not ignore. Contracts that should have renewed had quietly expired. Deliveries that should have arrived had been delayed just long enough to create doubt with my customers. Even the landlord's sudden hesitation about renewing my lease began to make more sense when I considered how connected everything had become. It was not chaos. It was design. And recognizing that changed something fundamental in the way I felt. The confusion I had been carrying began to settle into something clearer, something steadier, and far less forgiving. I closed the register early that day, not because there was nothing left to do, but because I finally understood that continuing to operate as if nothing had changed was no longer an option. I gathered my records, every invoice, every agreement, every receipt I had carefully kept over the years, and placed them into a single box, the same box I had once used to store holiday decorations. As I lifted it, I felt the weight of it in my hands, not just paper, but years of work, of trust, of assumptions that had never been questioned until now. I drove back to the rental in silence, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the road, and for the first time since everything began to unravel, I did not feel like I was being pushed out of my own life. I felt like I was stepping away from something that had already been taken apart behind my back. That evening, I sat at the small table again, the same place where I had felt so uncertain just days before, and I began to go through the documents one by one, not searching for mistakes, but for leverage. I was no longer trying to understand why this had happened. I was beginning to understand how it had been done and, more importantly, what still remained within my control. I did not sleep much that night, not because of worry, but because my mind had finally stopped circling the same questions and started arranging answers instead, quiet and deliberate, like pieces falling into place after years of being scattered. I sat at that small table with the box of documents open in front of me, reading slowly, not skimming, not rushing, letting each line tell me something I had missed before, and what I found was not chaos or bad luck but structure, agreements that still held, accounts that had not been touched, signatures that carried weight far beyond what Daniel or Vanessa seemed to understand. There were things I had set up years ago, back when my husband was still alive, precautions he had insisted on in his calm, careful way, protections that had felt unnecessary at the time because we trusted our family, because we believed that what we built would be respected. I remembered sitting at his desk one evening, listening as he explained why certain assets should remain solely in my name, why some accounts should never be merged, why independence was not a lack of trust but a form of security, and I had nodded without fully grasping how important those decisions would become. Now, as I traced my finger over those same documents, I realized he had not been planning for failure. He had been planning for possibility, for a day when I might need to stand on my own without asking anyone for permission. That realization settled into me with a kind of quiet strength I had not felt in weeks. The next morning, I made a few phone calls, not many, just enough, reaching out to people I had not spoken to in a long time but who still recognized my voice without hesitation, a former advisor, an old contact from the early days of my business, someone who understood numbers in a way I never had to because I trusted him to do it for me. The conversations were simple, direct, no explanations about family, no emotional context, just facts and questions. And the responses I received were steady, professional, and, most importantly, respectful. No one spoke to me as if I were out of place or out of time. No one questioned whether I could make decisions for myself. By the end of the day, I had a clearer picture of what remained untouched, what could be moved, what could be rebuilt, and what I no longer needed to hold on to. I drove past my old house once that afternoon, not because I wanted to see them, but because I wanted to see how it looked from the outside now that I was no longer inside it. And it surprised me how ordinary it seemed, just another house on a quiet street, nothing about it reflecting the years I had poured into it, nothing about it showing what had been taken from me. I did not stop. I did not slow down. I just kept driving, and in that moment, I understood something that felt both simple and final. They had not taken everything. They had taken what was visible, what was easy to claim, what they believed defined my worth, but they had overlooked the parts that mattered most, the parts that were never handed to them in the first place. That evening, I returned to the rental, set the box of documents neatly back on the table, and for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity, because I finally knew that whatever they thought they had accomplished, it was only the beginning of a story they did not understand, and I was no longer standing in the middle of it without direction. By the next morning, I had stopped thinking in terms of what I had lost and started thinking in terms of what I could still build, and that shift, small as it seemed, changed the way everything looked around me. I returned to the shop one last time, not to reopen it, not to pretend things could go back to the way they were, but to close it properly on my own terms, with the same care I had used when I first opened it all those years ago. I moved slowly through the space, touching the shelves, the counter, the small details that had once felt permanent, and I did not rush the process, because I understood now that endings deserve the same attention as beginnings. I packed what was worth keeping, the tools I had chosen myself, the records that still held value, and left behind what no longer served a purpose, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. When I turned the sign on the door from open to closed for the last time, I did not feel defeated. I felt precise, as if I had finally drawn a line that should have been there long ago. Later that afternoon, I met with the advisor my husband had trusted, a man who spoke carefully and listened even more carefully, and I laid out everything in front of him without emotion, just facts, timelines, and documents. He reviewed them with quiet focus, asking only a few questions, and when he looked up at me, there was something in his expression that I recognized immediately, not sympathy, not surprise, but respect. He explained what I already suspected, that I still had options, more than I had allowed myself to consider, and that the structures we had put in place years ago had not disappeared simply because I had stepped away from my home. There were accounts untouched, investments that had grown quietly in the background, and assets that remained entirely under my control, protected not by secrecy, but by careful planning. I listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail, not as a revelation, but as confirmation of something I had begun to understand on my own. When the meeting ended, I did not rush to act. I drove back slowly, letting the information settle, allowing myself to feel the weight of it in a different way than before, not as a burden, but as a resource. That evening, I sat at the table again, the same place where everything had started to come apart, and I made a list, not of losses, but of possibilities. I wrote down what could be liquidated, what could be reinvested, what could be transformed into something new, and as the list grew, so did a quiet sense of direction that had been missing for weeks. I was not rebuilding what had been taken. I was creating something separate from it, something they had never been part of and would never have access to. For the first time, I stopped thinking about Daniel and Vanessa entirely. Not out of forgiveness and not out of anger, but because they were no longer relevant to the decisions I was making. The next steps I took would not involve them, would not consider them, and would not be shaped by what they had done. They had made their choices with confidence, believing they understood the full extent of my world, and in doing so, they had overlooked the one thing that mattered most. They had never really known me at all, and now, for the first time in a very long time, I was beginning to see exactly how much that mattered. The plan did not begin with anything dramatic, no sudden decisions, no grand announcements, just a series of quiet steps taken one after another with a level of focus I had not allowed myself in years, and the first of those steps was choosing not to rush. I gave myself a few days to move deliberately, to review every option with care, and when I finally made the call to begin, it felt less like a reaction and more like a continuation of something that had been set in motion long ago. I met with a real estate agent recommended by my advisor, someone who spoke with a calm confidence that matched the pace I had settled into, and I explained exactly what I was looking for. Without hesitation, not a compromise, not a temporary solution, but a place that reflected stability, privacy, and permanence. He showed me several properties over the course of a week, each one impressive in its own way, but none of them felt quite right until the morning we drove through a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood just outside the city limits, where the houses sat back from the road with a kind of quiet dignity that did not need to announce itself. The property we stopped at was larger than anything I had ever owned, a wide front lawn stretching out in soft green, a long driveway leading up to a house that stood solid and still, with tall windows that caught the light in a way that made everything feel open and calm. I walked through it slowly, taking in the details, the high ceilings, the natural light, the sense of space that did not feel excessive but intentional, and for the first time since I left my old home, I did not feel like I was stepping into something unfamiliar. I felt like I was stepping into something that had been waiting for me. I did not need to think about it for long. The decision once made felt simple. The paperwork moved quickly, faster than I expected, but I did not question it. I signed what needed to be signed, transferred what needed to be transferred, and within a matter of days, the house was mine, fully and completely, without conditions, without shared ownership, without anyone else's name attached to it. The move itself was quiet. I hired a small team, nothing excessive, just enough to handle the essentials, and I chose carefully what I brought with me, not out of necessity, but out of intention. I did not want to fill the space with reminders of what I had left behind. I wanted to build something new, something that belonged entirely to this moment. The first night I spent there, I walked through each room alone, not out of loneliness, but out of ownership, letting the silence settle in a way that felt entirely different from the silence I had known before. This silence was not empty. It was steady. It belonged to me. The next morning, I woke early, as I always had, and stood by one of the large windows overlooking the front lawn, watching the light shift across the grass, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel something close to peace, not because everything had been resolved, but because I knew, with complete certainty, that whatever came next would be shaped by my decisions alone, not by someone else's plan, not by someone else's assumptions, but by the quiet, deliberate choices I had finally given myself permission to make. It did not take long for them to find out, not because I told anyone, and certainly not because I made any effort to be seen, but because information has a way of traveling quickly when it promises something valuable. And within a day of settling into the house, I noticed the first shift, small at first, almost easy to ignore. A missed call from Daniel appeared on my phone, followed by a short message that felt unusually polite, asking how I had been, mentioning that it had been too long since we last spoke, as if time itself had simply slipped away without reason. I read it once, and set the phone down without replying. A few hours later, another message arrived, this one from Vanessa, written in a tone so carefully warm that it felt rehearsed, asking if I was doing well, suggesting that they had been thinking about me, that they missed me, that perhaps we could meet soon and talk. I did not respond to that either. The silence between us had taken weeks to build, and I was not interested in breaking it for the sake of appearances. The next morning, I was in the kitchen, preparing coffee in the same quiet way I had begun to appreciate, when I noticed a car slowly pulling into the driveway through the front window. I did not rush to the door. I did not feel surprised. I simply stood there for a moment, watching as the engine turned off and two familiar figures stepped out, their movements confident, almost casual, as if they were arriving somewhere they already belonged. Daniel looked around briefly, taking in the size of the property, the distance between the house and the road, the kind of details he had never paid attention to before, and Vanessa stood beside him with that same composed smile, the one she used when she believed she understood the situation completely. I opened the door before they had a chance to knock, not out of eagerness, but because I had no reason to delay what was clearly inevitable. Daniel's expression shifted the moment he saw me, a flicker of something uncertain passing through his eyes before he replaced it with something more controlled, more presentable. Vanessa stepped forward first, her voice light, almost cheerful, as if we were meeting under entirely different circumstances. She commented on the house, on how beautiful it was, how much space there seemed to be, how peaceful the area felt, and Daniel nodded along, adding that it was exactly the kind of place that would be perfect for a family to share. I listened without interrupting, without reacting, allowing their words to fill the space between us, while I observed the ease with which they had rewritten the narrative in their own minds. There was no mention of what had happened before, no acknowledgement of the way things had ended, only an assumption that whatever distance had existed could be replaced with something more convenient now that the circumstances had changed. Vanessa glanced past me into the house, taking in the interior with quick, practiced attention, and then she said it, simply and directly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They had been thinking, she explained, that it made sense for all of us to live together, that there was more than enough room, that it would be good for everyone, that we could start fresh. Daniel smiled then, a little too quickly, agreeing with her, adding that it would solve a lot of problems, that it was practical, that it was the right thing to do. I stood there, looking at them both, not with anger, not with disbelief, but with a clarity that felt almost distant, as if I were watching a conversation I had already seen play out before, only this time from a place where their assumptions no longer held any weight. I stepped aside and let them walk in, not as an invitation but as an observation, because sometimes it is more revealing to let people show you exactly who they are when they believe they have already been accepted. Vanessa moved first, her steps light but purposeful, her eyes scanning the room with quiet calculation, taking in the furniture, the layout, the openness of the space, as if she were already deciding how it could be rearranged. Daniel followed a step behind, less certain, though he tried to hide it with a casual tone, commenting on how nice everything looked, how different it was from what he expected, as if he had the right to an expectation at all. I closed the door behind them and walked toward the living room, taking a seat without asking them to join me, letting the silence stretch just enough for them to feel the absence of the response they were expecting. Vanessa filled it quickly, continuing where she had left off outside, speaking about how this arrangement could work, how it would be easier for everyone, how families support each other in times of transition, her words carefully chosen, polished, designed to sound reasonable rather than opportunistic. Daniel nodded along, adding small agreements, reinforcing her points without ever quite leading the conversation himself, and I noticed how easily he had settled into that role, how natural it had become for him to follow rather than question. I listened to every word without interruption, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear how far they would go, how completely they would commit to this version of reality where nothing needed to be acknowledged and everything could simply be reset. Vanessa began to speak about specific details then, about which rooms would make the most sense, how the upstairs space could be used, how they could bring in some of their furniture to make it feel more like home, and the word she used lingered in the air for a moment. Home, spoken with a familiarity that did not belong to her. I leaned back slightly, watching her as she spoke, and I realized that she was not asking for permission, not really. She was outlining a plan she believed had already been accepted, a continuation of the same pattern that had removed me from my own life without ever requiring a direct confrontation. Daniel glanced at me then, as if waiting for some kind of confirmation, some sign that I was following along, that I understood, that I would once again step aside to make things easier for everyone else. I met his gaze and held it for a moment, long enough for him to shift slightly where he stood, and then I looked back at Vanessa, allowing the quiet in the room to settle into something more solid, something that could not be smoothed over with polite language. They had said everything they needed to say, revealed every assumption they had carried with them when they drove up that long driveway, and there was nothing left for me to clarify. I did not feel anger as I sat there, only a kind of distance, as if the conversation had already ended, and they were the only ones still speaking, unaware that the ground beneath them had changed completely. I let the silence hold for a moment longer, long enough for their confidence to begin to shift into something less certain, and then I stood up slowly, not in a dramatic way, not to make a point, but simply because I was ready to finish what they had started. I walked to the small console table near the entryway and picked up a folder I had placed there earlier that morning, a simple thing, nothing impressive, just a thin stack of papers held together neatly, and I brought it back with me, setting it down on the coffee table between us, without a word. Vanessa's eyes moved to it immediately, curiosity flickering across her face, while Daniel glanced at me as if trying to anticipate what I was about to say, but I did not speak right away. Instead, I opened the folder and turned it toward them, letting the documents face outward so they could read the headings themselves. It did not take long. The language was clear, precise, and not open to interpretation. The house was held in a private trust, structured years ago, with conditions that were simple but absolute. It was not transferable. It was not shared. It could not be claimed, occupied, or used by anyone other than me without explicit authorization that I had no intention of giving. I watched as Vanessa's expression changed first, the careful composure slipping just enough to reveal the calculation underneath, her eyes moving quickly across the page as if searching for a detail she could challenge, something she could reinterpret, but there was nothing there for her to work with. Daniel leaned forward slightly, reading more slowly, his brow tightening as the meaning settled in, and for a moment, he looked younger than I remembered, not in years, but in awareness, as if he was seeing something he had never needed to consider before. I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top of it, not possessively, but with quiet certainty, and then I finally spoke. I told them that this house was not a solution to their problems, that it was not an extension of the life they had chosen without me, and that it was certainly not a place they could simply step into because it was convenient now. My voice was steady, not raised, not emotional, just clear. I did not revisit what had happened before. I did not list their actions or ask for explanations. There was no need. They knew. What mattered was what came next, and what came next did not include them in the way they expected. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, something about misunderstanding, about working things out, about family, but the words did not carry the same confidence they had only minutes earlier. Daniel said my name quietly, as if that alone might change the direction of the moment, but I did not respond to that either. I stepped back toward the door, opening it with the same calm movement I had used when I first let them in, and I waited, not impatiently, not forcefully, just long enough for them to understand that the conversation had reached its end. There was a pause, a brief hesitation where they seemed to consider pushing further, saying more, trying again, but the certainty in the room had shifted, and even they could feel it. Vanessa turned first, her expression carefully neutral again, though the tension remained in the set of her shoulders, and Daniel followed a step behind, slower this time, as if each movement required more thought than before. They walked past me without speaking, out onto the driveway where their car still sat waiting, and I closed the door quietly once they were outside, the soft click of the latch settling into the silence of the house. I did not watch them leave. I did not need to. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the door, and then I turned back toward the living room, toward the space that was entirely mine, and I understood with complete clarity that what I had done was not an act of anger, or even of justice. It was simply a boundary, one that should have been there all along, finally made visible in a way that could not be ignored.